Top 5 real-life criminal minds that shocked the world. The body was found just after dawn, half hidden by pine needles along a quiet stretch of Washington shoreline. The tide had gone out, leaving the sand cold and exposed. A jogger noticed a shoe first, then a strand of hair caught on driftwood. By the time deputies arrived, the fog was lifting, revealing what no one wanted to say out loud: another young woman, gone, with no obvious sign of who had taken her. There was no struggle at the scene. No drag marks. No witnesses. Just absence, arranged with disturbing care. Detectives had already learned to dread mornings like this. The pattern was forming faster than they could admit. College towns. Parks. Beaches. Women who vanished between classes or errands, last seen talking to a stranger who looked ordinary enough to trust. Too ordinary. At the university district, flyers stacked up on corkboards. Smiling faces stared back at students who tried not to look too long. Names were whispered between lectures. Parents called police stations demanding answers that didn't exist yet. And somewhere nearby, the man responsible was watching the coverage with the same calm focus he used to study law textbooks. He understood systems. He understood people. And most dangerously, he understood how to look harmless. The first solid break didn't come from a confession or a witness. It came from a detail so small it almost slipped through. Multiple women had mentioned a man named Ted. He wore a cast sometimes. Asked for help. Dropped books on purpose. Spoke softly. Thanked them politely. He blended in because he was supposed to. A law student. Politically active. Intelligent. Someone you'd trust with your sister's phone number. Investigators ran the name through databases and found nothing alarming. No record. No history. But patterns don't lie forever. A detective began mapping disappearances with pushpins. Red dots crept across Washington, then spilled into Oregon, Utah, Colorado. Different jurisdictions. Different departments. One predator moving freely between them, exploiting the cracks in communication. The suspect list grew and shrank daily. Tips poured in. False leads wasted hours. The killer stayed ahead, adjusting his methods with chilling precision. He learned what attracted attention and what didn't. He learned how much fear the public could tolerate before demanding answers. Then he vanished from Washington entirely. Months later, a traffic stop in Utah changed everything. A patrol officer pulled over a tan Volkswagen Beetle for a routine violation. Inside were items that didn't belong together: handcuffs, rope, a ski mask. The driver explained calmly. Too calmly. He was cooperative, polite, even joked with the officer. The arrest should have ended it. Instead, it opened a door investigators hadn't realized existed. The suspect's name was Theodore Bundy. He denied everything, of course. He always did. In interviews, he spoke with confidence, correcting detectives on legal terminology, questioning their assumptions. He requested law books. He requested interviews. He requested control. And disturbingly, he often got it. Witnesses picked him out of lineups, but doubts lingered. The evidence was circumstantial. Jurors hesitated. Bundy studied them like a chessboard, learning who avoided eye contact, who leaned forward, who might sympathize. When he was finally convicted in Utah, many believed the nightmare was over. They were wrong. During a pretrial hearing in Colorado, Bundy was granted the unthinkable. He was allowed to represent himself. He argued his own motions, questioned witnesses, and when the opportunity came, he acted. In broad daylight, he slipped a handcuff, bolted from a courthouse window, and disappeared into the mountains. The manhunt was immediate and frantic. Roadblocks went up. Helicopters searched the treeline. But Bundy knew how to move without being seen. He survived on stolen food, slept in abandoned cabins, and waited. When he was recaptured days later, authorities tightened security. But not enough. Weeks after being returned to custody, Bundy escaped again, this time for good. He didn't head west. He went south. Florida wasn't ready for him. In Tallahassee, Bundy walked into a student housing area under cover of night. There was no pretense this time. No cast. No charm. The violence was sudden, chaotic, and devastating. Survivors would later struggle to describe how quickly safety had vanished. By the time police arrived, the damage was done. A campus was left in shock. A community reeled. And the realization set in: this wasn't just a killer. This was someone who adapted, learned, and escalated. Bundy was arrested again within days, this time on evidence too overwhelming to ignore. Bite mark analysis. Eyewitness accounts. Physical proof that stripped away his carefully constructed image. In court, he performed one last time. He cross-examined witnesses. He smiled for cameras. He proposed to a woman during trial, knowing full well the spectacle it would create. Even in chains, he demanded attention. Psychologists watched closely. Here was a mind capable of compartmentalizing cruelty and civility with terrifying ease. A man who didn't see people as people, but as variables in a system he believed he could control. As appeals dragged on, Bundy began to talk, not to confess, but to narrate. He spoke of another killer, another perspective, another entity, as if distance could soften truth. Investigators listened, hoping to recover bodies, to give families closure. Some locations were revealed. Others were vague. Some remains were found. Many never would be. The closer the end came, the more Bundy seemed to enjoy the process. He understood the power of withholding. He knew that unanswered questions were his final leverage. On the eve of his execution, he offered more information. Names, places, promises. Authorities rushed to act, unsure which leads were real and which were games. In the chaos, one detail emerged that sent a chill through the room. Bundy mentioned a location no one had connected before. A place outside the existing maps. A site that didn't match any known timeline. A place investigators had overlooked because it didn't fit the pattern. When they checked the records, they realized the unthinkable. There was a missing window, weeks where Bundy's movements couldn't be accounted for at all. And if that window held answers, it meant one thing. The story wasn't finished. Not even close. The gap in the timeline was only 26 days long, but it terrified the investigators more than any confirmed crime scene ever had. 26 days where Theodore Bundy's movements were undocumented. No credit card use. No confirmed sightings. No arrests. No witnesses who could place him with certainty. For a man who left trails of fear everywhere he went, the silence was unnatural. Detectives spread maps across conference tables, tracing highways between Colorado and Florida. They circled rest stops, rural towns, isolated parks. Each possibility carried a quiet dread. If Bundy had been active during that window, and experience suggested he always was, then there were victims no one had even started looking for. Bundy knew this. He watched the urgency grow from his cell. When investigators returned to question him, he appeared cooperative, almost relaxed. He spoke about hypotheticals, about what someone like him might do when traveling unnoticed. He described routes that avoided major highways. He mentioned places where no one would hear screams, then corrected himself with a faint smile. I mean, where no one would notice disturbances. Every word was calculated. Psychologists reviewing the interviews noticed a shift. Earlier, Bundy had craved admiration. Now, he craved control. The more desperate the investigators became, the more vague his answers grew. He fed them breadcrumbs, then pulled back, forcing them to chase. One name kept surfacing in the background files. Women reported missing in rural counties, cases written off as runaways or accidents. At first glance, they didn't fit. Different ages. Different circumstances. But when a detective overlaid the disappearances with Bundy's likely travel path, the pattern snapped into focus. The window wasn't empty. It was crowded. In Utah, a hiker's remains were re-examined after years in storage. In Colorado, a Jane Doe case resurfaced with fresh forensic attention. In Idaho, a family reopened a file they'd been told was closed forever. Each case added weight to the realization that Bundy's reach was broader and colder than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, Bundy's presence inside the jail was destabilizing everything around him. Guards reported unusual behavior. Inmates avoided him, sensing something off even among criminals. One guard requested reassignment after Bundy began greeting him by name, reciting details about his family he should not have known. "He watches," the guard said. "Always watching." Letters poured in from across the country, some hateful, some pleading, some disturbingly affectionate. Bundy responded selectively, crafting different versions of himself for each audience. To one, he was repentant. To another, misunderstood. To a third, a source of insider knowledge about violent crime. Law enforcement worried about copycat behavior. Media coverage became a liability. The killer was turning his own prosecution into a stage. Then Bundy did something unexpected. He asked to speak privately with a detective who had interviewed him years earlier, back in Washington. No lawyers. No cameras. Just a conversation. The meeting took place in a small room with bare walls and a single table. Bundy leaned forward, hands folded, his voice low. He talked about the early days, how easy it had been at first, how people wanted to help, how authority figures rarely questioned someone who looked like them. Then he shifted. "There are things you haven't found," he said. "Things you won't unless you listen carefully." The detective kept his face neutral, but inside, alarms were blaring. Bundy described a location near water, but not a beach. A place where sound carried strangely. Where trees grew too close together. He mentioned a detail no one had released publicly, a mark left on one victim's clothing, a knot tied a specific way. It was real. The detective realized Bundy wasn't confessing. He was bargaining, trading fragments of truth for relevance. When pressed for names or exact coordinates, Bundy leaned back and smiled. "You'll have to earn that," he said. As appeals failed and execution dates loomed, Bundy's leverage increased. Families waited for closure that might never come. Investigators debated whether engaging him was worth the cost. Every interaction risked giving him what he wanted most, attention. But time was running out. In the final weeks, Bundy offered a map. Hand-drawn. Vague. But one marking led to a wooded area outside a small Florida town, far from his known crime scenes. Authorities moved fast, unwilling to miss another chance. They searched for days. On the fourth morning, a cadaver dog alerted near a shallow depression covered by leaves. The soil beneath was darker. Disturbed long ago, then left untouched. They uncovered remains. The discovery confirmed their worst fear. Bundy hadn't been slowing down. He had been refining. Back at the prison, Bundy was informed of the find. He nodded once, satisfied. He corrected one detail about the location, unprompted. It was as close to ownership as he would ever allow himself. As the execution date approached, Bundy's tone changed again. He grew restless. He spoke faster. He offered more leads but less clarity. Investigators scrambled to verify what they could, knowing some of it was undoubtedly manipulation. On the final night, a chaplain sat with him. Bundy spoke about responsibility, about influence, about how violence spreads when it's misunderstood. He framed himself as a lesson, not a monster. Outside the prison, crowds gathered, some demanding justice, others seeking spectacle. Cameras waited. History held its breath. Bundy's last attempts to delay failed. His final statements revealed nothing new. When it was over, the system exhaled. But the silence he left behind was heavy. Files remained open. Names remained unknown. Families remained without answers. The window in the timeline stayed partially dark, its edges defined by bones and memories, its center still empty. And that emptiness raised a question investigators could never fully escape. If one man could vanish so completely, adapt so efficiently, and manipulate so deeply, how many others were still out there, watching, learning, and waiting for their own moment to step into the light? The world thought it had seen the worst. It hadn't yet. The morning after the execution, the phones didn't stop ringing. Families called with questions that had waited decades. Detectives called other detectives, reopening drawers they'd once slammed shut. Journalists called asking whether the case was finally over. No one gave a clean answer, because everyone felt the same unease. Ted Bundy was gone. The damage he left behind wasn't. In offices across the country, investigators laid out timelines that no longer ended with a name. The missing window still loomed, 26 days that refused to resolve into a neat conclusion. Leads from Bundy's last-minute statements had produced some remains, but not enough. Too many disappearances sat just outside the confirmed routes, close enough to be plausible, distant enough to remain uncertain. The truth was uncomfortable. Bundy hadn't just killed. He had demonstrated something far more dangerous. He had proven how easily trust could be weaponized. Law enforcement training materials quietly changed in the years that followed. Stranger danger warnings expanded to include people who didn't look dangerous at all. Behavioral science units grew in influence. Profilers studied Bundy not for his brutality, but for his adaptability, how he learned from mistakes, adjusted his approach, and exploited human assumptions. But even as institutions evolved, the echoes continued. In Washington, a cold case team reopened files from the 1970s using modern forensic techniques. DNA brought clarity to some families and disappointment to others. A few cases once suspected to be Bundy's were ruled out. Others, long dismissed, suddenly aligned too well. In Utah, a former detective admitted something he'd carried quietly for years. "We were looking for a monster," he said. "We didn't realize the monster was someone who understood us better than we understood ourselves." That understanding extended to the courtroom. Bundy's decision to represent himself, to manipulate procedure, to turn trials into performances, had exposed vulnerabilities in the legal system. Judges later cited his case when restricting self-representation in capital trials. The system had learned, but only after paying a steep price. For survivors and families, learning came differently. Some found closure in confirmation. Others found only anger. Many realized the same thing at once, that the man who had taken so much from them had also taken something intangible. Certainty. The ability to believe that evil announced itself clearly. A woman who'd escaped Bundy by refusing to help him load books into his car spoke at a university years later. "I didn't survive because I was brave," she said. "I survived because something felt off and I listened." That's it. Her words spread. Not as fear, but as vigilance. And yet, even vigilance had limits. In the years following Bundy's death, other names began to surface. Different faces. Different methods. Familiar patterns. Some cited Bundy in interviews. Others avoided the comparison entirely. But investigators noticed the same traits appearing again and again. Charm used as camouflage, intelligence turned predatory, systems gamed rather than confronted. Bundy hadn't created the archetype. He'd refined it. One profiler described it bluntly: he didn't just commit crimes. He taught future offenders what worked. That realization haunted the field. It raised ethical questions no one wanted to answer. How much coverage was too much? How much analysis crossed the line into instruction? How do you study a criminal mind without accidentally giving it a blueprint? The answers shifted with each new case. In Florida, the site of Bundy's final crimes became a quiet marker of how quickly safety can fracture. Students walked past buildings that looked unchanged, unaware of how close history lingered. Administrators updated protocols. Counselors emphasized awareness. But time did what it always does: it softened the edges. Until something else happened. Years later, a tip came in from a neighboring state. A man had been stopped for a minor violation. His car contained items that didn't belong together. He spoke politely, calmly. He knew the law. The officer remembered a training video. A name mentioned in passing. A pattern explained with clinical precision. The man was arrested. He wasn't Bundy. He never claimed to be. But the shadow was there. Back in Washington, the cold case unit closed one final file connected to the missing window. The evidence wasn't conclusive enough for certainty, but it was enough to give a family a death certificate. The mother cried when she signed the paperwork. Not because of grief, she'd lived with that for years, but because uncertainty had finally loosened its grip. Still, several names remained unmatched. They always would. In academic journals, Bundy's case continued to be cited as a turning point. Not because it ended something, but because it revealed something fundamental. Evil didn't always roar. Sometimes it asked for help. Sometimes it wore ambition and education and charm. Sometimes it understood your rules better than you did. That understanding had consequences beyond one life. It forced institutions to confront their blind spots. It forced the public to reconsider what danger looked like. And it forced investigators to accept a hard truth, that no system, no profile, no checklist could guarantee safety. Only awareness could shift the odds. In a final interview recorded before his execution, Bundy had attempted to frame himself as a cautionary tale. He spoke about influence, about responsibility, about how violence replicated when misunderstood. Some dismissed it as manipulation. Others heard something colder, a man acknowledging the legacy he'd leave behind. Not remorse. Replication. When the tape ended, the interviewers sat in silence. He later said the most chilling part wasn't what Bundy admitted. It was what he didn't. There was no apology that matched the scale of harm. No insight that made sense of it all. Just an acceptance that he had played his role in something larger than himself. The world moved on as it always does. But in quiet rooms, detectives still stare at maps. In archives, files still wait. In training academies, Bundy's name is still spoken, not as a legend, but as a warning. Because the most dangerous criminals aren't always the ones who hide in shadows. Sometimes they stand in plain sight. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Before you look away, subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment. Because once the story begins, there's no safe exit.